Hiber-Nation 55. Grizzly's Growls presents Stories from the Hiber-Nation. Read by David Grizzly Smith. Wild Animals I Have Known by Ernest Thompson Seton, as read by David Grizzly Smith. The Springfield Fox, Part 3. Meanwhile, the hens had continued to disappear. I had not betrayed the den of cubs. Indeed, I thought a good deal more of the little rascals than I did of the hens, but Uncle was dreadfully wrought up and made most disparaging remarks about my woodcraft. To please him, I one day took the hound across to the woods, and seating myself on a stump on the open hillside, I bade the dog to go on. Within 3 minutes he sang out in the tongue all hunters know so well, "Fox, fox, fox," straight away down the valley. Well, after a while I heard them coming back. There I saw the fox, Scarface, loping lightly across the river bottom to the stream. In he went and trotted along in the shallow water near the margin for 200 yards, and then came out straight toward me. Though in full view, he saw me not, but came up the hill watching over his shoulder for the hound. Within 10 feet of me, he turned and sat with his back to me while he craned his neck and showed an eager interest in the doings of the hound. Ranger came bowling along the trail till he came to the running water, the killer of scent, and here he was puzzled, but there was only one thing to do. That was by going up and down both banks, find where the fox had left the river. The fox before me shifted his position to get a better view, and watched with a most human interest all the circling of the hound. He was so close I saw the hair of his shoulder bristle a little when the dog came in sight. I could see the jumping of his heart on his ribs and the gleam of his yellow eye. When the dog was wholly balked by the water trick, it was comical to see. He could not sit still, but rocked up and down in glee, and reared on his hind feet to get a better view of the slow, plodding hound. With mouth opened nearly to his ears, though not at all winded, he panted noisily for a moment, or rather he laughed gleefully, just as a dog laughs by grinning and panting. Old Scarface wriggled in huge enjoyment as the hound puzzled over the trail so long that when he did find it, it was so stale he could barely follow it, and did not feel justified in tonguing on it at all. Well, as soon as the hound was working up the hill, the fox quietly went into the woods. I had been sitting in plain view only 10 feet away, but I had the wind and kept still, and the fox never knew that his life had for 20 minutes been in the power of the foe he most feared. A ranger also would have passed me as near as the fox, but I spoke to him, and with a little nervous start he quit the trail, and, looking sheepish, lay down at my feet. This little comedy was played with variations for several days, but it was all in plain view from the house across the river. My uncle, impatient at the daily loss of hens, went out himself, sat on the open knoll, and when old Scarface trotted to his lookout to watch the dull hound on the river fiat below, my uncle remorselessly shot him in the back, at the very moment when he was grinning over a new triumph. Part 4. But still, the hens were disappearing. My uncle was wrathy. He determined to conduct the war himself, and sowed the woods with poison baits, trusting to luck that our own dogs would not get them. He indulged in contemptuous remarks on my bygone woodcraft and went out evening with a gun and the 2 dogs to see what he could destroy. Well, Vix knew right well what a poison bait was. She passed them by or else treated them with active contempt, but once she dropped down the hole of an old enemy, a skunk, who was never afterward seen. Formerly, old Scarface was always ready to take charge of the dogs and keep them out of mischief, but now that Vix had the whole burden of the brood, she could no longer spend time in breaking every track to the den, and was not always at hand to meet and mislead the foes that might be coming too near. The end is easily foreseen. Ranger followed a hot trail to the den, and Spot, the fox terrier, announced that the family was at home and then did his best to go in after them. Well, the whole secret was out now, and the whole family doomed. The hired man came round with a pick and a shovel to dig them out, while we and the dogs stood by. Old Vix soon showed herself in the near woods and led the dogs away off down the river, where she shook them off when she thought proper by the simple device of springing on a sheep's back. The frightened animal ran for several hundred yards, and then Vix got off, knowing that there was now a hopeless gap in the scent, and returned to the den. But the dogs, baffled by the break in the trail, soon did the same, to find Vix hanging about in despair. Vainly she tried to decoy us away from her treasures. Meanwhile, Paddy plied both pick and shovel with vigor and effect. The yellow, gravelly sand was heaping on both sides, and the shoulders of the sturdy digger were sinking below the level. After an hour's digging, enlivened by the frantic rushes of the dogs after the old fox who hovered in the near woods, Pat called, "Here they are, Sut." In the den at the end of the burrow, and cowering as far back as they could, were the 4 woolly little cubs. Before I could interfere, a murderous blow from the shovel and a sudden rush for the fierce little terrier ended the lives of 3. The 4th, and the smallest, was barely saved by holding him by his tail high out of reach of the excited dogs. He gave one short squeal, and his poor mother came at the cry, and circled so near that she would have been shot but for the accidental protection of the dogs, who somehow always seemed to get between, and whom she once more led away on a fruitless chase. The little one, saved alive, was dropped into a bag, where he lay quite still. His unfortunate brothers were thrown back into their nursery bed and buried under a few shovelfuls of earth. We guilty ones then went back into the house, and the little fox was soon chained in the yard. No one knew just why he was kept alive, but in all a change of feeling had set in, and the idea of killing him was without a supporter. He was a pretty little fellow, like a cross between a fox and a lamb. His woolly visage and form were strangely lamb-like and innocent, but one could find in his yellow eyes a gleam of cunning and savageness as unlamb-like as could possibly be. As long as anyone was near, he crouched, sullen and cowed, in his shelter box, and it was a full hour after being left alone before he ventured to look out. My window now took the place of the hollow basswood. A number of hens of the breed he knew so well were about the cub in the yard. Late that afternoon, as they strayed near the captive, there was a sudden rattle of the chain, and the youngster dashed at the nearest one and would have caught him, but for the chain, which brought him up with a jerk. He got on his feet and slunk back to his box, and though he afterward made several rushes, he so gauged his leap as to win or fail within the length of the chain, and never again was brought up by its cruel jerk. As night came down, the little fellow became very uneasy, sneaking out of his box, but going back at each slight alarm, tugging at his chain, or at times biting it in fury while he held it down with his 4 paws. Suddenly he paused, as though listening. Then, raising his little black nose, he poured out a short, quavering cry. Once or twice this was repeated, the time between being occupied in worrying the chain and running about. Then the answer came, the far-away yap-yurr of the old fox. A few minutes later a shadowy form appeared on the woodpile. The little one slunk into his box, but at once returned and ran to meet his mother with all the gladness that a fox could show. Quick as a flash she seized him and turned to bear him away by the road she came. But the moment the end of the chain was reached, the cub was rudely jerked from the old one's mouth, and she, scared by the opening of a window, fled over the woodpile. On my going out, she fled into the dark woods, but there by the shelter box were two little mice, bloody and still warm, food for the cub, brought by the devoted mother. And in the morning I found the chain was very bright for a foot or two next to the little one's collar. On walking across the woods to the ruined den, I again found signs of Vixen. The poor, heart-broken mother had come and dug out the bedraggled bodies of her little ones. There lay the three little baby foxes, all licked smooth now, and by them were two of our hens, freshly killed. The newly heaved earth was printed all over with telltale signs that told me that here, by the side of her dead, she had watched like Rizpah. Here she had brought them their usual meal, the spoil of her nightly hunt. Here she had stretched herself beside them and vainly offered them their natural drink, and yearned to feed and warm them as of old. But only stiff little bodies under their soft wool she found, and little cold noses still and unresponsive. A deep impress of elbows, breasts, and hocks showed where she had laid in silent grief and watched them for long, and mourned as a wild mother can mourn for its young. But from that time she came no more to the ruined den, for now she surely knew that her little ones were dead. Tip the captive, the weakling of the brood, was now the heir to all her love. The dogs were loose to guard the hens. The hired man had orders to shoot the old fox on sight. So had I, but was resolved never to see her. Chicken heads that a fox loves and a dog will not touch had been poisoned and scattered through the woods, and the only way to the yard where Tip was tied was by climbing the woodpile after braving all other dangers. And yet, each night, old Vix was there to nurse her baby and bring it fresh-killed hens and game. Again and again I saw her, although she came now without awaiting the querulous cry of the captive. The second night of the captivity I heard the rattle of the chain, and then made out that the old fox was there, hard at work digging a hole by the little one's kennel. When it was deep enough to half bury her, she gathered into it all the slack of the chain, and filled it again with earth. Then, in triumph, thinking she had gotten rid of the chain, she seized little Tip by the neck and turned to dash off up the woodpile. But alas, only to have him jerked roughly from her grasp. Poor little fella, he whimpered sadly as he crawled into his box. After a half an hour, there was a great outcry among the dogs, and by their straightaway tonguing through the far wood, I knew they were chasing Vix. Away up north they went in the direction of the railway, and their noise faded from hearing. Next morning the hound had not come back. We soon knew why. Foxes long ago learned what a railroad is. They soon devised several ways of turning it to account. One way is when hunted to walk the rails for a long distance just before a train comes. The scent, always poor on iron, is destroyed by the train, and there is always a chance of hounds being killed by the engine. But another way, more sure but harder to play, is to lead the hounds straight to a high trestle just ahead of the train, so that the engine overtakes them on it, and they are surely dashed to destruction. This trick was skillfully played, and down below we found the mangled remains of old Ranger, and learned that Vix was already wreaking her revenge. That same night she returned to the yard before Spot's weary limbs could bring him back, and killed another hen and brought it to Tip, and stretched her panting length beside him that he might quench his thirst, for she seemed to think he had no food but what she brought. It was the hen that betrayed to my uncle the nightly visits. My own sympathies were all turning to Vic's, and I would have no hand in planning further murders. Next night my uncle himself watched, gun in hand, for an hour. Then, when it became cold and the moon clouded over, he remembered other important business elsewhere and left Paddy in his place. But Paddy was uneasy, as the stillness and anxiety of watching worked on his nerves. And the loud bang, bang, an hour later left us sure only that powder had been burned. In the morning we found Vix had not failed her young one. Again, next night found my uncle on guards, for another hen had been taken. Soon after dark a single shot was heard, but Vix dropped the game she was bringing and escaped. Another attempt made that night called forth another gunshot. Yet next day it was seen by the brightness of the chain that she had come again, and vainly tried for hours to cut that hateful bond. Such courage and staunch fidelity were bound to win respect, if not toleration. At any rate, there was no gunner in wait the next night, when all was still. Could it be of any use? Driven off thrice with gunshots, would she make another try to feed or free her captive young one? Would she? Hers was a mother's love. There was but one to watch them this time, the fourth night, when the quavering whine of the little one was followed by that shadowy form above the woodpile, but carrying no fowl or food that could be seen. Had the keen huntress failed at last? Had she no head of game for this her only charge, or had she learned to trust his captors for his food? No, far from all this. The wildwood mother's heart and hate were true. Her only thought had been to set him free. All means she knew she tried, and every danger braved, to tend him well and help him to be free. But all that had failed. Like a shadow she came, and in a moment was gone, and Tip seized on something dropped, and crunched and chewed with relish what she brought. But even as he ate, a knife-like pang shot through, and a scream of pain escaped him. Then there was a momentary struggle, and the little fox was dead. The mother's love was strong in Vix, but a higher thought was stronger. She knew right well the poison's power. She knew the poison bait, and would have taught him, had he lived, to know and shun it too. But now, at last, when she must choose for him a wretched prisoner's life or sudden death, she quenched the mother in her breast and freed him by the one remaining door. It is when the snow is on the ground that we take the census of the woods, and when the winter came it told me that Vix no longer roamed the woods of Arundel. Where she went it never told, but only this, that she was gone. Gone, perhaps, to some other far-off haunt, to leave behind the sad remembrance of her murdered little ones and mates. Or gone, may be, deliberately, from the scene of a sorrowful life, as many a wildwood mother has gone, by the means that she herself had used to free her young one, the last of all her brood.
Thank you for listening to Stories from the Hiber-Nation. Comment on the website at grizzliesgrowls.com. This program is offered under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.